Imagine waking up to a land that has sustained your family for 3 generations, only to realize that the very earth beneath your boots is quietly turning into a graveyard. For decades, the American rancher has been symbols of self-reliance, standing against the elements, protecting their livestock, and trusting the water that flows from their wells. But what happens when the enemy isn't a harsh winter or a sudden drought, but an invisible, toxic force leaking from a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire next door? This is the story of a man who noticed his cattle dying, demanded answers, and triggered a war against a faceless conglomerate. He thought he was just protecting his livelihood. But when the lab results finally came back, he realized the corporation hadn't just poisoned his water, they had uncovered a secret that changed everything. The morning sun usually brought a sense of peace to the high plains, painting the vast expanses of wild grass in hues of amber and gold. For John Miller, this land was more than property, it was a living, breathing testament to his grandfather's sweat and his father's sacrifice. The Miller Ranch spanned over 5,000 acres of rugged terrain, a place where hard work was the only currency that truly mattered. John knew every ridge, every fence line, and every seasonal creek that snaked through the property. He could tell the health of his herd just by the way they moved across the valley in the early hours. But lately, a heavy, suffocating silence had begun to settle over the pastures. It started innocently enough, a subtle shift in the wind, a strange metallic tang in the air that wasn't there before. John initially dismissed it as the changing of the seasons, but deep in his gut, a cold knot of unease was beginning to form. Just 5 miles to the north, looming over the horizon like a mechanical fortress, stood the automated refining facility owned by Apex Chemical Holdings. For years, the town viewed Apex as a necessary evil. They brought jobs, paved the local roads, and sponsored the high school football team. The flashing lights and towering smokestacks were simply part of the background noise, a stark contrast to the pristine, untouched beauty of the surrounding wilderness. John had always maintained a policy of live and let live. The corporation operated on their side of the fence, and he operated on his. It was a fragile truce built on mutual avoidance. However, contrast framing reveals the true nature of this relationship. While the corporation measured its success in quarterly dividends and stock prices, John measured his in the birth of new calves and the purity of his soil. One was an empire built on extraction, the other was a life built on stewardship. The first definitive sign of trouble appeared near the northern boundary, where a natural artesian spring fed into John's primary stock pond. It was the lifeblood of his cattle, especially during the scorching summer months. One Tuesday afternoon, John rode his horse down to the water line to check the filtration pump. What he found made him pull hard on the reins. Along the muddy banks, the normally vibrant green reeds had turned an ash-gray color, brittle and crumbling to the touch. The water itself, usually crystal clear, carried a faint, iridescent sheen on its surface, shimmering like spilled gasoline under the harsh sunlight. A strange, sweet smell, reminiscent of decaying fruit and industrial solvents, hung low over the mud. John dismounted, kneeling by the edge to inspect the water closely. His horse whinnied nervously, stepping back and refusing to lower its head to drink. Animals possess an ancient, instinctual understanding of danger, and right then, every instinct in that animal was screaming. The turning point, within 48 hours, the invisible threat materialized into devastating loss. John found 3 of his finest heifers collapsed near the tree-line, their bodies bloated and lifeless. The local veterinarian, a family friend named Doc Evans, was baffled. There were no signs of external trauma, no mountain lion tracks, and no obvious symptoms of known livestock diseases. It looked as though their internal systems had simply shut down simultaneously. As John watched Doc Evans take tissue samples, a dark realization began to settle over him. The spring water wasn't just contaminated, it was active. The corporate empire over the hill had breached the perimeter, not with security guards or legal documents, but with an invisible poison creeping through the deep aquifers. John knew he couldn't stay silent. He needed proof, he needed data, and most importantly, he needed to know exactly what Apex Chemical Holdings was letting leak into the veins of his land. He packed a sterile glass jar into his saddlebag, determined to capture the evidence before the corporate lawyers could sweep it under the rug. What John didn't know was that taking that sample would set off a chain reaction. Apex wasn't just running a standard chemical plant, they were hiding a massive structural failure in their primary waste containment cell, a failure that, if exposed, would bankrupt the company and trigger a federal investigation. By demanding a water test, John wasn't just a rancher complaining about runoff, he was a loose thread that could unravel a multi-billion-dollar cover-up. As he sealed the glass jar and watched the strange, shimmering liquid settle inside, the clock began to tick. He was entering a battlefield where facts were manufactured, opposition was silenced, and the truth was the most dangerous asset a man could possess. The corporate response was swift, calculated, and terrifyingly polite. Within 24 hours of John filing an official inquiry with the state environmental agency, a pristine black SUV pulled up the dusty driveway of the Miller Ranch. Two men stepped out, wearing tailored suits that looked completely absurd against the rugged backdrop of the high plains. They introduced themselves as community liaison officers from Apex Chemical Holdings. They didn't arrive with threats, they arrived with smiles, clipboards, and a glossy brochure detailing the company's commitment to ecological sustainability. They assured John that Apex took any concern from local landowners with the utmost seriousness. They offered to run their own internal testing, completely free of charge, and even hinted at a generous, neighborly goodwill payout to compensate for his lost livestock, provided he signed a standard non-disclosure agreement. This is where the contrast framing becomes undeniable. To John, those three lost heifers represented generations of careful breeding, a devastating blow to his family's livelihood, and a breach of sacred trust. To the suits from Apex, those animals were merely an line-item expense, an acceptable cost of doing business that could be easily erased with a swipe of a corporate pen. John looked at the paperwork they slipped across his kitchen table. The text was dense, filled with complex legal jargon designed to overwhelm a regular person. But one clause stood out clearly: by accepting the funds, John would forfeit his right to ever pursue legal action or speak publicly about any environmental issues on his property. They weren't trying to help him, they were trying to buy his silence before he could look too closely at what was happening in his backyard. John refused to sign. He politely but firmly escorted the men off his property, watching as their smiles evaporated into cold, calculating stares. The moment the SUV disappeared over the ridge, John knew the clock was ticking faster. He couldn't trust the state agency to move quickly enough, and he certainly couldn't trust Apex to investigate themselves. He needed an independent, certified laboratory that was completely outside the sphere of influence of the corporate giant. He drove 3 hours out of his county to a private university lab in the next state, handing over the sealed glass jar of shimmering spring water to a technician who promised a comprehensive chemical breakdown within 5 business days. The surveillance begins. On his drive back, John noticed a white pickup truck idling at the edge of his property line. It didn't belong to any neighbor he knew. When he approached, the truck sped away, leaving a cloud of dust. The psychological warfare had begun. Over the next 48 hours, the pressure intensified. John started noticing strange anomalies around his ranch. His satellite internet connection, usually reliable, suddenly experienced unexplained outages. Unmarked security vehicles began patrolling the public county road just outside his fence line, their drivers sitting silently behind tinted windows, watching him through binoculars. Even the local bank, which held the seasonal operating loan for the Miller Ranch, suddenly called John to express renewed concerns about his debt-to-income ratio following the loss of his livestock. The corporate machine wasn't just targeting his land, they were moving to isolate him financially, socially, and psychologically, cutting off his lifelines before he could even mount a defense. What Apex didn't realize was that trying to intimidate a third-generation rancher is like trying to push over an old-growth oak tree. The pressure only made John dig his roots deeper into the soil. He spent his nights sitting on his porch with a rifle across his knees, watching the perimeter, while his days were consumed by an agonizing wait for the telephone to ring. Every time the phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat, expecting the lab technician's voice on the other end. He knew that the results in that lab wouldn't just be numbers on a page, they would be the ultimate verdict on whether his family's future was secure or completely ruined. As the 5th day drew to a close, the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long, bleeding shadows across the empty pastures. John sat at his desk, staring at the silent telephone. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He began to wonder if the lab had been compromised, if the corporation's reach had extended across state lines to suppress the data. Just as the anxiety reached a boiling point, the phone rang, cutting through the darkness like a siren. John snatched the receiver, his knuckles turning white. The voice on the other end wasn't the polite secretary he expected. It was the lead toxicologist, and his voice was trembling with a mixture of disbelief and genuine fear. "Mr. Miller," the scientist said, "I need you to tell me exactly where you got this sample, and I need you to make sure you aren't drinking that water." The toxicologist's voice on the line sounded less like a scientist reading data and more like a man delivering a declaration of war. He explained that the water sample didn't just contain standard industrial runoff or agricultural pesticides. The levels of heavy metals, specifically cadmium, arsenic, and a highly unstable synthetic compound known as compound 9X, were thousands of times higher than the legal limit permitted by federal law. Compound 9X was an experimental catalyst used exclusively in high-volume chemical refining, a substance so volatile that its production required strict federal oversight and completely isolated containment vaults. It wasn't supposed to exist outside a vacuum, yet here it was, saturated into the soil and flowing directly into the water supply of a family ranch. The scientist explained the devastating physical mechanics of what this meant for the land. Compound 9X was highly water-soluble, meaning it didn't just sit on the surface, it bonded with the underlying aquifer on a molecular level. It was an invisible assassin. Once ingested by livestock, it caused immediate internal hemorrhaging and systemic organ failure, which perfectly explained the sudden, violent deaths of John's heifers. But the most terrifying part of the report was the timeline. Based on the sheer density of the contamination in the sample, this leak hadn't started a week ago when John found the dead cattle. This containment failure had been slowly weeping into the deep water table for at least 18 months. The true cost: for a year and a half, the corporation knew their containment vaults were failing. Instead of shutting down operations to fix the leak, a move that would cost them millions in lost revenue, they chose to sit on the secret. They gambled with the lives of everyone living downstream, betting that the vastness of the underground aquifers would dilute the poison before anyone noticed. Contrast framing reveals the chilling corporate calculus at play. To the board of directors, a multi-million-dollar repair shutdown was an unacceptable hit to their quarterly stock performance. To them, the long-term destruction of a localized ecosystem and the health of a few rural families was a manageable legal risk, an item that could be tied up in court for decades by expensive defense attorneys until the victim simply ran out of money or died. Armed with the official certified lab report, John felt a strange mixture of validation and cold fury. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't overreacting. He held the definitive proof of a corporate crime in his hands. But as he looked out his window into the darkness, he realized that having the truth and surviving long enough to use it were two entirely different things. The headlights of the unmarked white pickup truck were still visible at the edge of his property, parking just past the boundary line, its engine idling silently in the cool night air. They knew he had received the results. The corporate machine was no longer operating in the shadows, they were closing in. John knew that if he tried to drive to the local sheriff's office, the corporate scouts would intercept him. If he emailed the document using his compromised internet connection, it could be flagged and suppressed before it reached a single news outlet. He needed to secure the physical copies of the data and find a way to get them to a federal authority that Apex couldn't buy off. He spent the next 2 hours packing a waterproof case with the lab results, detailed maps of his property's water system, and photographs of his dead livestock. He was preparing for a siege, turning his family home into a fortress of evidence. Suddenly, the floodlights illuminating his barnyard flickered and died. The steady hum of the electric transformer at the edge of his porch cut out entirely, plunging the entire ranch house into pitch-black darkness. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a standard power outage caused by the wind. They had cut the lines. Outside, the distant sound of heavy boots crunching against the gravel driveway broke the silence. The corporate entity had decided that legal intimidation and financial pressure were taking too long. They were moving in to reclaim the evidence by force, intending to make both the sample and the troublesome rancher disappear into the vast, lonely expanse of the high plains. The darkness inside the house was absolute, a heavy velvet shroud that amplified every sound from the yard. John didn't freeze. He moved with the fluid precision of a man who had spent his entire life navigating this specific terrain in the dead of night. He grabbed his grandfather's hunting rifle from the rack, not with the intention of starting a firefight, but because on these plains, a weapon was the only equalizer against the lawless. He slipped the waterproof case containing the lab results into a rugged canvas backpack, strapping it tightly across his chest. Through the kitchen window, he saw three distinct silhouettes moving past the silhouette of the old tractor, their flashlights casting tight, low beams along the ground. They weren't wearing police uniforms, they were wearing tactical gear, operating with the cold efficiency of private security mercenaries. What the recovery team didn't understand was the fundamental law of the land. Contrast framing shows the critical error they were making. They viewed the ranch as a map grid, a piece of geometry to be cleared and controlled using technology and numbers. John viewed the ranch as an extension of his own body. He knew exactly which floorboards in the hallway creaked under pressure, which window frames could be opened silently without a sound, and exactly how the wind current brushed against the cedar trees at the back of the house. While the intruders focused on the front doors, expecting a trapped, terrified civilian, John quietly slipped out through a narrow root cellar door at the baseline of the foundation, melting seamlessly into the dark shadows of the northern pasture. The cat-and-mouse game, the wind was his ally, carrying the sound of the mercenaries' voices away from him while bringing their clumsy movements right to his ears. "Secure the house, find the papers, and destroy the phone," one whispered. They were looking for a paper trail, completely unaware that the trail had already escaped into the open wild. John didn't head for his truck, that would be an obvious trap. Instead, he struck out on foot toward the rugged sandstone canyons that cut through the eastern edge of his property. It was a treacherous, 5-mile trek through broken earth, hidden badger holes, and thick brush, but it was the only path completely invisible from the main road. If he could reach the highway on the other side of the ridge by dawn, he could flag down the interstate semi-trucks and escape the corporate perimeter entirely. As he climbed higher into the rocky terrain, the flashlights back at the homestead grew smaller, resembling distant, angry stars. But just as he thought he had gained a decisive advantage, a high-pitched, rhythmic buzzing sound began to echo from the sky above. John looked up, his heart sinking. High overhead, a commercial surveillance drone equipped with thermal imaging cameras was sweeping the valley in a grid pattern. Its infrared lens could pick up the heat signature of a living creature from a mile away, slicing through the darkness and rendering his knowledge of the terrain completely useless. The corporate machine had brought military-grade technology to a local land dispute. John threw himself flat beneath a thick shelf of overhanging limestone, pressing his body against the cold, damp stone to mask his heat signature. The drone hovered directly above his position for what felt like an eternity, its mechanical hum vibrating through his teeth, before slowly continuing its sweep toward the south. He was running out of time, running out of land, and running out of places to hide. Every step forward was a gamble against an enemy that owned the sky, owned the politicians, and owned the very water running through the valley. But the most shocking twist was yet to come. As John finally reached the crest of the eastern ridge, gasping for air and looking down at the distant interstate highway, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Parked at the highway junction wasn't just another Apex security vehicle. Sitting under the flashing amber lights of a construction zone were two official state trooper vehicles. The officers weren't looking for intruders, they were standing shoulder to shoulder with the Apex corporate executives, reviewing a digital map on a tablet. The conspiracy didn't stop at the corporate boundary line. The state authorities weren't there to investigate the poisoned water, they were actively acting as the outer perimeter of the cover-up, waiting to arrest John the moment he stepped off his own land. Seeing the state troopers standing shoulder to shoulder with the Apex corporate executives shattered any remaining illusions John had about working within the system. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow: you cannot appeal to a system of justice when the judge, the jury, and the executioner are all on the corporate payroll. If he walked down that hill to hand over the evidence, the paperwork would vanish into an incinerator, and he would be quietly processed into a prison system under fabricated charges, never to be heard from again. He had to pivot. He had to stop playing their game on their terms and find a baseline of leverage that the corporation couldn't bribe or intimidate. John retreated back into the shadows of the sandstone canyon, his mind racing. He realized that Apex's greatest vulnerability wasn't a slow-moving federal lawsuit or an environmental fine, it was their stock price and their public image. They were a publicly traded conglomerate, terrified of volatility. If the public discovered that they had knowingly poisoned an entire regional aquifer with compound 9X for 18 months, the immediate investor panic would wipe out billions in market capitalization before their lawyers could even draft a response. He didn't need a sheriff, he needed a megaphone. He needed to bypass the local blackout entirely and broadcast the truth directly to the world. The counterattack, John remembered the automated telemetry hub Apex had installed near his northern fence line, a satellite-linked weather and data station that transmitted facility metrics directly to their international headquarters. It ran on an independent, unthrottled satellite uplink that didn't rely on the local power grid. Leaving the ridge behind, John doubled back, utilizing the deepest ravines to navigate toward the automated hub. The irony was stark, he was going to use the corporation's own multi-million-dollar infrastructure to destroy their cover-up. Reaching the metal enclosure of the telemetry hub, he used a fencing tool to breach the outer casing. He wasn't trying to sabotage it, he was looking for the direct network interface portal. He pulled the encrypted drive from his canvas pack, the one containing the complete, certified digital copies of the toxicologist's report, the time-stamped photos of his dying cattle, and the geo-tagged coordinates of the poisoned artesian spring. With trembling fingers, John patched his storage drive into the active satellite terminal. He didn't just upload the files to a single agency, he initiated a massive data dump, routing the unencrypted files simultaneously to dozens of independent investigative journalists, major national news desks, environmental advocacy groups, and global short-seller firms that specialized in exposing corporate fraud. As the progress bar on the small terminal screen filled up, the drone overhead buzzed angrily, circling back toward his position. The security teams were closing in, their flashlights cutting through the brush just 50 yards away. But it was too late. The data hit the upper atmosphere, scattering across the global network in a matter of seconds. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic for Apex Chemical Holdings. By the time the stock market opened the following morning, the independent reports had already gone viral. Before the corporate PR team could issue a scripted denial, Apex's stock price plummeted by over 30% in early trading, triggering an automatic regulatory freeze. The sheer scale of the public outrage forced federal regulators from Washington to bypass the compromised local authorities entirely, dispatching an armed task force to seize the refining facility and secure the failing containment vaults. The faceless corporate empire had been brought to its knees, not by an army, but by a single rancher who refused to let his legacy be poisoned in the dark. This story is a stark reminder that the modern battlefields aren't always fought with weapons, they are fought over resources, information, and the courage to stand up against corrupted power. Corporations count on our silence and our willingness to look the other way when the odds seem completely overwhelming. But as John Miller proved, a single individual armed with undeniable facts and the determination to fight can shatter even the most expensive cover-ups. It makes you wonder, how many other invisible threats are flowing beneath our feet right now while those in power pretend everything is perfectly fine? If you believe that stories like John's need to be told, and that corporate corruption should never be allowed to silence regular people, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive investigation into the hidden forces shaping our world. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how John handled the situation. Would you have stayed and fought, or taken the payout? Thank you for watching, and stay vigilant.